The human mind is an intricate illusion, constantly spinning narratives, playing tricks, and convincing us that we are its prisoners. From the moment we wake up to the moment we fall asleep, we are engaged in an endless inner dialogue, thoughts about the past, worries about the future, interpretations of the present. It never stops. And yet, the fundamental mistake we make is believing that we are this mind, that the voice in our head defines us. This belief is the source of all suffering. We have been conditioned to think that if we can just control our thoughts, if we can force our minds into submission, then we will be free. But this is a flawed approach. The more you try to silence the mind, the louder it becomes. Try to suppress a thought, and it will only grow stronger. Try to avoid a particular emotion, and it will chase you relentlessly. The problem is not the mind itself, but our attachment to it. When you look at a river, you don't try to control the water. You don't demand that the waves stop forming or that the current change direction to suit your desires. You simply watch. You observe the movement without interference, and in doing so you experience a sense of peace. The mind, too, is like a river, constantly flowing, shifting, evolving. The problem arises when we grasp at every thought, when we become entangled in the current, instead of standing on the shore as a witness. Detachment is the key to freedom. But detachment does not mean indifference, nor does it mean rejection. To detach from thought is not to push it away, but to see it for what it is, just a passing phenomenon, like clouds moving across the sky. The sky does not cling to the clouds, nor does it resist them. It simply allows them to appear and disappear, untouched by their presence. The same applies to the mind. Thoughts come and go, but your awareness, the deeper you, remains unchanged. The first step toward mastering the mind is to recognize that you are not your thoughts. Consider this. If you can observe your thoughts, then who is the one doing the observing? Who is aware of the mind's activity? There is a silent witness within you, always present, always watching. But because it does not speak in words, it is often overlooked. The mind, loud and persistent, drowns out this deeper awareness, leading us to believe that it is all there is. But if you simply stop, if you take a step back and listen, you will begin to notice the quiet space behind all thought. This space is where true peace lies. Not in controlling the mind, not in forcing yourself to think only positive thoughts, but in recognizing that thoughts are merely ripples on the surface of a vast ocean. No matter how turbulent the waves, the depths remain calm, still, untouched. This is your true nature. Most people live in constant resistance. They resist their own emotions, their own thoughts, their own experiences. When pain arises, they fight against it. When fear appears, they try to push it away. But resistance only strengthens what is resisted. When you struggle against the mind, you reinforce its hold on you. The more you engage with a thought, the more real it becomes. The only way to break free is to allow, to let every thought come and go, without grasping, without fighting, without identifying. Imagine sitting by a busy road. Cars pass by, some fast, some slow, some beautiful, some ugly. If you try to stop every car, direct traffic, or chase after one that catches your attention, you will exhaust yourself. But if you simply sit and watch, if you allow the cars to pass without interference, you remain at peace. The thoughts in your mind are like these cars. They come and go, appearing and disappearing. The moment you stop trying to control them, they lose their power over you. But this is easier said than done, because the mind is addicted to engagement. It wants to analyze, to judge, to fix. It wants to believe that every thought is urgent, that every problem must be solved immediately. This is the trick of the ego. The ego thrives on identification. It wants you to believe that you are your thoughts, that you are your emotions, that without them you are nothing. But the truth is the opposite. You are not the storm, you are the sky. You are not the mind, you are the awareness that watches it. When you understand this, something remarkable happens. The grip of the mind begins to loosen. The thoughts that once disturbed you no longer hold the same weight. Fear may still arise, but it no longer paralyzes you. Doubt may still appear, but it no longer dictates your actions. You begin to see the mind as it truly is, a tool, not a servant, not a ruler. But this realization is not something that can be forced. You cannot will yourself into detachment. You can only see the truth and let it unfold naturally. The more you observe your thoughts without attachment, the more you will experience the space between them. In this space, there is silence. In this silence, there is clarity. And in this clarity, you will begin to sense a freedom you never knew existed. The world will continue to move, life will continue to present challenges, but you will no longer be swept away by every passing wave. You will walk through life with a sense of ease, not because the world has changed, but because you have changed your relationship to it. You are no longer imprisoned by your mind. You are no longer caught in the endless cycle of thought and reaction. You have stepped outside the game, and in doing so you have discovered something profound. The ability to simply be. The mind is a fascinating instrument, but it is also a source of great confusion. It is not the thoughts themselves that cause suffering, but our attachment to them, our tendency to believe them, identify with them, and let them dictate our emotions and actions. The secret to mastering the mind is not in suppressing thought, nor in controlling it, but in seeing it for what it truly is. Just passing energy, just waves on the surface of consciousness. The challenge, however, is that we have spent a lifetime mistaking the mind for the self. We believe that what we think defines who we are, and in doing so we become prisoners of our own illusions. Detachment from thought is often misunderstood. Many people think it means rejecting or avoiding thoughts, but that is not the case. True detachment is not an act of pushing thoughts away, but of recognizing that they are not you. A bird may fly across the sky, but the sky remains unaffected. Thoughts arise, persist for a while, and dissolve, but the awareness that watches them remains unchanged. The key to mastering your thoughts is to shift your identity from being the thinker to being the observer. Consider this: if you can watch your thoughts, then who is doing the watching? If you can notice your emotions, who is the one noticing? There is something deeper within you, something beyond the stream of thought, that is always present. This silent witness has no form, no words, no attachment. It simply is. And the more you recognize this, the less power thoughts have over you. Most people spend their lives reacting to every thought as if it were an absolute truth. When a fear-based thought arises, they immediately become anxious. When a memory of past pain emerges, they immediately relive the suffering. They do not see that these thoughts are merely echoes, that they are not real in the present moment. This is the great illusion of the mind. It convinces you that every thought is urgent, important, and personal. But what if you could just observe these thoughts, without grasping at them, without letting them define your reality? Imagine sitting in front of a television screen watching a movie. When you are deeply engaged in the film, you forget that you are just watching. You feel the emotions of the characters, experience the tension of the plot, react to every scene. But the moment you remember, this is just a movie, the intensity lessens. You are still watching, but you are no longer lost in it. The same applies to the mind. Thoughts are like scenes in a movie. They come and go, but the real you remains unchanged. To detach from thought, you must first become aware of its movement. This is not about stopping thought. Trying to silence the mind is like trying to stop the wind. Instead, it is about stepping back and watching the mind. When a thought arises, instead of engaging with it, simply notice it. Ah, here is a thought about fear. Here is a thought about doubt. Here is a thought about anger. By naming the thought rather than reacting to it, you create a space between you and the mind. This space is where freedom begins. Most people are completely entangled in their thoughts, lost in a cycle of mental chatter. But when you step back and watch, even for a moment, you experience something profound. You realize that you are not bound to these thoughts. You do not have to believe them. You do not have to let them dictate your state of being. But the ego resists this. The ego wants you to stay attached to thought because it thrives on identification. It wants you to believe that you are your fears, your desires, your past, your future. It convinces you that without thoughts, without mental narratives, you would be nothing. This is the great lie. The truth is that beyond thought, there is something far more vast, far more peaceful, your pure awareness. The way to access this awareness is through stillness. Not the stillness of a mind free from thought, but the stillness of the observer who is no longer reacting to thought. When you sit in silence, when you watch the mind without interference, something shifts. The thoughts continue to arise, but they lose their grip on you. You begin to see them as fleeting, as temporary, as unreal in the deepest sense. And in this realization, there is great power. Life is filled with uncertainties. The mind will always find reasons to worry, to stress, to create problems where none exist. But once you understand that the mind is merely a tool, that it is not you, you are no longer controlled by its fluctuations. You can watch the storms of thought pass without being swept away. You can observe emotions arise without becoming lost in them. You remain centered, unmoved, free. The world will continue to challenge you. People will continue to provoke reactions. But when you have detached from the mind, you are no longer at the mercy of external circumstances. You carry an unshakable stillness within you, a deep sense of presence that nothing can disturb. This is the essence of mastery, not controlling the mind, but transcending it. Most people believe that peace comes from fixing external problems, from changing situations, from achieving certain goals. But true peace is not found in the external world. It is found in the realization that you are not the mind, that you are the one who watches. When you no longer cling to thought, when you no longer seek identity in mental stories, you are free. Free to move through life with ease, free to experience emotions without being enslaved by them, free to exist in the present moment without the weight of past and future. This is not something that happens overnight. Detachment is a practice, an unfolding, a gradual awakening. But the more you step back and watch, the more you recognize the mind for what it is. A passing phenomenon, like waves on the ocean. You are not the waves. You are the vast, limitless ocean beneath them. And when you see this clearly, the mind loses its power over you. You are no longer trapped. You are no longer bound. You are free. The mind is a fascinating paradox. It is both the source of our greatest wisdom and our deepest suffering. It constructs the reality we experience, yet it is often the very thing that clouds our perception. Most people live their entire lives enslaved by their own thoughts, reacting to every mental impulse as if it were the absolute truth. But what if I told you that this identification with thought is the very thing keeping you from true freedom? The secret to mastering the mind is not in controlling it, but in understanding it, in detaching from its endless chatter and recognizing that you are something far greater than your thoughts. The problem is that we mistake our thoughts for reality. If a thought arises telling us we are not good enough, we believe it. If a thought reminds us of a past mistake, we relive the pain as if it were happening all over again. If the mind projects an imagined future of fear, we experience that fear in the present moment. And yet, none of these thoughts are real. They are just fleeting electrical signals in the brain, passing clouds in the sky of consciousness. But because we have never learned to step back and observe the mind, we take each thought as an undeniable fact. This is why detachment from thought is essential. To detach does not mean to suppress, ignore, or reject thoughts. Suppression is just another form of resistance, and whatever you resist only becomes stronger. Detachment is something much deeper. It is the ability to watch thought without becoming entangled in it. It is the recognition that you are not the mind. Think of a flowing river. If you were to jump into the river and be carried away by the current, you would have no control. You would be at the mercy of the water, struggling against its force. But if you were to step onto the riverbank and simply watch the water flow, you would see it for what it is. Just movement. Just passing energy. The mind is no different. If you are caught in its currents, you suffer. But if you step back and observe, you remain unaffected, untouched by its turbulence. This ability to observe the mind without attachment is what leads to true mastery. But the ego resists this realization. The ego thrives on identification. It wants you to believe that you are your thoughts because that is how it maintains its control. The ego will say, "Without thoughts, who am I?" It will try to pull you back into its narratives, convincing you that you must engage with every thought, analyze it, dissect it, solve it. But this is a trap. The more you engage with thought, the more you become entangled in its illusion. True detachment is not an intellectual exercise, it is a shift in perception. It is the direct experience of watching the mind without identifying with it. You begin to see thoughts as they are, temporary, fleeting, insignificant. You begin to realize that you are the space in which thoughts arise, not the thoughts themselves. And the moment you see this clearly, something profound happens. The mind loses its power over you. This does not mean the mind becomes silent. The mind will continue to generate thoughts, just as the heart continues to beat and the lungs continue to breathe. But now, instead of being lost in thought, you simply witness it. Instead of reacting to every mental impulse, you allow it to pass. This is where true inner peace begins. Not in controlling thought, but in no longer being controlled by it. One of the greatest obstacles to this realization is our conditioning. From the moment we are born, we are taught to rely on thought as the primary tool for navigating life. We are conditioned to believe that thinking is the key to solving all problems, that the more we analyze and plan, the more control we have. But what if I told you that the most profound moments of clarity do not come from thinking at all? They come from stillness, from the space between thoughts, from the quiet presence that exists beneath the mental noise. Have you ever noticed that when you are deeply present, thought disappears? When you are fully engaged in a beautiful moment, watching a sunset, listening to music, feeling the embrace of a loved one, your mind becomes still. In these moments, you are not lost in the past or worrying about the future. You are simply here. And in that presence, there is a deep peace, a deep knowing that requires no thought at all. This is the state of true awareness, the state of being fully present, fully alive, untouched by the fluctuations of the mind. The problem is that most people experience this state only by accident. They stumble into moments of presence without realizing that this is their natural state. But what if you could live in this awareness? What if you could exist in a place where thoughts come and go, but they no longer disturb your inner peace? This is not an abstract concept, it is a practice. Every time you catch yourself lost in thought, simply step back and observe. Every time the mind tries to pull you into fear, into regret, into judgment, remind yourself, these are just thoughts. I am not my thoughts. This simple awareness begins to create space, and in that space you discover something extraordinary. You discover yourself, not the self that is defined by thoughts, memories, and identities, but the self that is beyond all of it, the self that is pure awareness, pure presence, pure being. The world will continue to throw challenges your way. People will continue to provoke reactions. But when you have detached from the mind, nothing can disturb your inner stillness. You no longer take thoughts personally. You no longer take emotions as absolute truth. You move through life with a deep sense of freedom, untouched by the illusions that once controlled you. Most people seek peace outside of themselves. They believe that if they could just change their circumstances, if they could just fix their problems, they would find happiness. But happiness does not come from external change. It comes from internal realization. When you no longer identify with the mind, when you see thought for what it is, you discover a peace that cannot be taken from you. A peace that is always here, always waiting beneath the noise of the mind. And so the great secret is this: you do not need to master the mind. You only need to realize that you are not the mind. The moment you see this clearly, you are free, free from suffering, free from illusion, free to exist in the fullness of the present moment. This is true liberation, not in escaping thought, but in transcending it. And in this realization you awaken to something far greater than thought, far greater than the mind. You awaken to the truth of who you really are. The journey to mastering your thoughts through detachment is not about rejecting the mind, but about seeing it for what it truly is. Most people live in constant identification with their thoughts, reacting to them as if they were absolute truths. But when you step back and observe the mind rather than becoming entangled in it, you realize something profound. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts arise and disappear, much like waves in the ocean. The ocean does not cling to the waves, nor does it fear them. It simply allows them to come and go. This is the essence of detachment. But how do you cultivate this detachment in everyday life? How do you apply this understanding so that it transforms your experience rather than remaining an abstract concept? The answer lies in conscious awareness, in the practice of observing the mind without resistance, without grasping, without fear. One of the first steps in detachment is to recognize the impermanence of thoughts. Thoughts appear and disappear on their own, like passing clouds in the sky. If you observe them without clinging, you will see that they lose their grip on you. But the moment you attach yourself to a thought, by believing it, identifying with it, or resisting it, you become caught in its illusion. This is how suffering arises, not from thoughts themselves, but from our attachment to them. For example, suppose you experience a thought that says, "I am not good enough." If you immediately identify with it, you will feel its emotional weight. You may start recalling past failures, comparing yourself to others, or imagining future disappointments. The thought, which was originally just a passing mental event, now dominates your experience. But what if instead you simply observed it? What if you said to yourself, here is the thought, I am not good enough, but that is just a thought, not reality. The moment you do this, you create space. You recognize that thoughts are merely mental constructs, not the truth of who you are. This is the power of detachment. It does not mean suppressing or ignoring thoughts. It means witnessing them with clarity and neutrality. It means understanding that just because a thought arises does not mean it has any inherent truth. The mind produces thousands of thoughts every day, and most of them are repetitive, conditioned, and reactive. If you believed every single one, your life would be a chaotic storm of emotions. But when you cultivate detachment, you gain the ability to remain still in the midst of this mental storm. Another key aspect of detachment is letting go of the need for control. Most people try to control their thoughts, attempting to force themselves into a particular mental state. But the very act of controlling the mind is itself a form of attachment. It is like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you grasp, the more it slips away. True mastery is not about controlling thought, but about being free from the need to control it. This is why meditation is such a powerful tool. When you sit in stillness and observe your thoughts without reacting, you begin to experience the spaciousness of awareness. You see that thoughts come and go on their own, without your interference. Over time, this practice allows you to disidentify from the mind, to see thought as just another passing phenomenon, like the sound of the wind or the movement of the clouds. Detachment also applies to emotions. Just as thoughts are transient, so too are emotions. Anger, fear, sadness, joy, each of these emotions arises and fades in time. But if you attach yourself to an emotion, if you identify with it, you prolong its existence. For example, if you feel anger and immediately say, "I am angry," you merge your sense of self with that emotion. You are no longer simply experiencing anger, you have become it. But if instead you say, "There is anger arising within me," you create distance. You see that the emotion is not who you are, it is merely something passing through your awareness. This understanding transforms the way you experience life. You no longer react impulsively to every thought and emotion. Instead, you watch them with curiosity, with equanimity, with peace. And when you no longer take thoughts and emotions personally, you discover something extraordinary, a deep, unshakable inner stillness. This stillness is not dependent on external circumstances. It is not something that comes and goes based on what happens in your life. It is always present, always accessible, beneath the surface of the mind. But to experience it, you must be willing to let go. To let go of attachment to thought, to let go of the need for control, to let go of identification with the ego. The ego will resist this process. The ego thrives on attachment, on drama, on the constant narrative of me and mine. It wants to keep you engaged in thought because that is how it maintains its illusion of control. But once you see through the ego's tricks, once you recognize that you are not the mind, the ego's hold on you begins to dissolve. This is true freedom. Not freedom in the sense of doing whatever you want, but freedom from being enslaved by the mind. When you detach from thought, you are no longer pulled in 1,000 different directions by every passing impulse. You become grounded, centered, at peace. And in this peace, something even greater is revealed, your true nature. You begin to see that beyond all thoughts, beyond all emotions, beyond all identities, there is something timeless and infinite within you. Call it consciousness, call it presence, call it the self. It does not matter what name you give it. What matters is that you realize it. Once you do, life takes on an entirely new dimension. You are no longer caught in the illusion of past and future, no longer controlled by fear and desire. You move through the world with a sense of ease, a sense of clarity, a sense of profound inner stillness. The ups and downs of life no longer shake you, because you have found the unchanging truth within yourself. But this is not something that can be understood intellectually, it must be experienced. And experience only comes through practice. The more you watch the mind, the more you cultivate detachment, the more you rest in pure awareness, the more this truth reveals itself to you. And so the great paradox is this: the mind, which once seemed to be your greatest obstacle, becomes your greatest teacher. Every thought is an opportunity to practice detachment. Every emotion is an opportunity to witness without reaction. Every challenge is an opportunity to deepen your understanding. When you live with this awareness, You are no longer a prisoner of the mind. You are no longer caught in its endless fluctuations. You become the observer, the witness, the unshakable presence that remains untouched by the passing storms of thought. And in this realization you discover the ultimate secret. You are not the mind. You are not the thoughts. You are not the emotions. You are the awareness that sees them. You are the vast, infinite space in which all of this unfolds. And in that space, there is nothing to fear, nothing to chase, nothing to resist. Only the endless, boundless freedom of being.